Okay, I think we can make a start. It's a bit after 7. Welcome to the last scrutiny meeting of the administration. Filming at meetings, can we take that bit as read? Yeah, we all know that bit. Apologies for absence. Sorry.
I've had apologies from Councillor Hearn. Sorry, Councillor Hearn, I beg your pardon.
Any urgent business? No. Declarations of interest from members?
Yeah, I remembered the RCA and my sister's GP in Tottenham.
Any deputations, petitions? Approving the minutes of the meeting on the 29th of January and the special meeting on the 1st of March. We happy to approve those minutes?
Yeah.
Yep. Good. And to receive and note the minutes of the scrutiny panel meetings, environment on the 31st of January, adults and health on the 8th of February. Yep, agreed. For various child care and sick child reasons, I'm proposing we move item 10 up to take now, so that we're not holding officers up who need to get away for their children. So can I pass over to you to introduce item 10?
Thank you very much, Councillor, and I very much appreciate you taking this item first on the agenda. So this item is the latest quarterly update position from the priority dashboards, and it sets out sort of trends, both demonstrating where progress has been good against our objective and outcomes in the corporate plan, and those which are more challenging. As you'll all be aware, the performance reports go to the individual scrutiny panels for more detailed consideration. Just thought it was worth highlighting that we've been using the information, the data and the evidence that's been building through these performance wheels to support our engagement with partners on the next iteration of the corporate plan as we work towards a new borough plan. It's been very much based on our evidence and just beginning to share what that is beginning to tell us. As I said, the report sets out at 4.6 where we've made good progress against the corporate plan priorities, and section 4.7 where there have been some areas where we haven't been able to do as well as we had anticipated for a number of reasons. It's worth saying that overall our progress against corporate plan objectives has been fairly strong. We've got 4 objectives which are currently RAG rated red, which indicates that we're unlikely to meet the corporate plan targets at this stage. As I said, this is providing the latest available data, and there's just one more quarter of data to collect as part of the corporate plan priority period. So I'm happy to take any questions and to present you the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Members got any particular points to raise? Councillor Connor, you have it.
Just looking at the different priorities, obviously within my own, priority 2, things like delayed transfers of care on page 72, once that's been acknowledged that that's increasing, which is in this, what would be your likely time to reassess that information and that data to put it back onto the site?
So as you'll appreciate, Councillor Connor, delayed transfer of care are very much a priority for ourselves and our NHS partners. So we have weekly call-overs with colleagues in the NHS on this. It's a matter which is looked at by officers at the Joint Commissioning and Finance Management Group on a monthly basis, and we have quarterly joint finance and performance partnership boards with the governing body of the CCG and members to consider in more detail. This is quite a volatile area. It's the case that a small number of delays, which last for several days, can quite adversely affect the rate. It's worth noting as well that whilst we are doing a huge amount of work on discharge to assess and new pathways, we do still have some challenges around mental health discharges, and also for there's a small number of discharges of younger adults as well, but predominantly we feel like we're making good progress. We're implementing quite a few new things at one time, as has been reported to Adults and Health Scrutiny Panel. And it's an area we're working very closely with NHS colleagues locally, and which is under scrutiny at regional and national level as well.
Sorry, Charlotte. Sorry, I meant to say, so how often do you update this? So is it quarterly? Do you sort of, or what's the time frame for the update? Sorry,
Councillor. So it is updated monthly, but in terms of performance reporting, it's a quarterly report to the Finance and Performance Partnership Board, and that's what we're formally reporting through to NHSE. Any particular issues at particular trust sites, there's a much more frequent scrutiny.
Can I just ask, so the Better Care Fund stretch target, are there any financial implications for not meeting that target then?
The way the Better Care Fund works, it sets aside some contingency within the fund for against a non-performance of targets. And so, yes, there are financial implications, not for us actually in the system, because we're not incurring social care charging for delayed transfers currently.
Councillor Gallagher.
Thanks, Chair. These may not specifically be within your area, Charlotte, but it was on page 71. It's Priority 5, Objective 2, around homelessness. So it says that to date, 41% of households who approach have been prevented from becoming homeless, which doesn't seem particularly high. It still means 59% are not prevented from becoming homeless. I mean, do you know how that compares to figures in previous years or indeed in other London boroughs? And then the next one was on page 73, in relation to development, so it's Priority 4, Objective 5. It just says all measures under this objective are currently ragged red. Would you be able to say a bit more about that, please?
Thank you. I'll need to get back to you in the detail of homelessness preventions, but just to say we felt this is an improving performance over time. As you'll be aware, across London, homelessness applications have been increasing, so actually steadying the rate and holding preventions has been considered good. Clearly, by the next time, the next full quarter reporting, there'll be the first impacts of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which should see a sort of significant shift in how we report on these indicators, which will need to feed into the next iteration of the corporate plan. It is very challenging in terms of numbers of households and the complexity of some of the cases that are being dealt with. In terms of Priority 4, Objective 5, I'll need to get back to you on that with a detailed response, because it is in relation to planning consents and how many have been approved, and I wouldn't want to give you the wrong information.
Councillor Connor.
So just one more on Priority 3, the robbery. This is obviously a police matter and resources directed by the police. So as we've got it as one of our priorities, is it that we have influence over asking the police to direct their resources in particular areas, or I'm just not quite sure. I mean, I understand we work very closely with our partners, but I'm just wondering why it's up on our dashboard. Is it something we have specific control over?
It's not something we have. We have influence, but not specific control. We work closely with our Met colleagues locally, but I think it's fair to say that these are priorities that are set through MOPAC, the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, and so they're not indicators that we directly influence. The last joint Community Safety Partnership and Health and Wellbeing Board meeting considered the new round of sort of MOPAC priorities for 2018-19, and so that the decision to agree that the priorities were the right ones was made at that board, but in terms of the influence, the most direct influence is clearly through policing activity, and we don't directly influence that. We are partners in the Community Safety Partnership.
So this is just for us to be aware, and it's just to flag it up with us rather than we actually have any influence or we can direct any influence in that direction.
So I think you asked me about control before, which is slightly different. Clearly, at working in partnership, there are layers of influence, but it's a sort of quite nuanced, subtle area. So we influence, and through this community safety partnership, clearly that is a statutory partnership between us and the police, which has a role in this area. As I said at the last Health and Wellbeing Board and Community Safety Partnership, this was a topic of conversation about the priorities going forward, recognising that some of these issues, there is a policing response, but earlier on there might be other responses, either through the NHS or the local authority, in terms of earlier intervention and prevention.
Any other points on this report? No. Okay. I mean, I just thank you for the work you've done in bringing these reports through over the period, which has been useful, I think, and has significantly helped the Scrutiny Committee and the panels in their work, and hope they continue to be useful. Thank you. Okay, I've had a request from Councillor Blake that we take, who is here on behalf of Councillor Hearn for items 13 and 14, that we take those quickly now because he has to get away. I don't envisage this.
I've got to be by 8. So
Were you okay if we? Yeah.
I've got to be gone by 8.
Yeah, as I say, I don't envisage Councillor Blake's items taking very long, actually. But okay, budget monitoring. Let's do that one. Sorry. Do you want to introduce where we are on this?
Yeah. So there's been a slight improvement in the position, actually, from the one that's reported in the report in front of you, but that will be incorporated into the outturn. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail into that, just in case the figures change. But clearly, from this report, you can see an improved position in Q3 from Q2. The overspend on the general fund is 5.4 million. It talks about 3.7, but that's taking away the HRA. It's worth saying for the 1.8 for the HRA that takes into account funding that will actually be spent in 2018 to 19. So as overrun into this financial year, which will then overrun almost certainly into 2018 to 19 spend. The three areas of concern remain adults, children, and TA to a lesser extent. When it comes to adults, there's been an improved position since Q2, but with children a significant worsening of 1.6 million. And as the Cabinet Member for Children has said, and it's just to reiterate what she said, ultimately we have statutory duties when it comes to protecting vulnerable children. We've seen an increase in our looked after children numbers and the cost of residential placements, but that's not just in Haringey, but that's London/nationwide. Councils across the country are dealing with those challenges, and I think that's probably on adults. As you'll see in 7.15, a significant chunk of that overspend comes from care packages, so 4.2 million coming from more demand than we anticipated, and also not being able to deliver on some prevention and diversion strategies where we were overly optimistic. And you might remember the Director for Adult Services coming and essentially explaining that in the savings proposals that were put together, there has been some double counting that has been accounted for in this year's MTFS, what went to full council in February and for 2018 to 19. And I'll leave it there.
All right. Any questions on that? Councillor Connor.
Thank you. So I was reading this report and I noted, especially on page 35, it said, as you've mentioned, Councillor Arthur, priority 1, only 23% of the approved savings will be delivered this year, and in priority 2, only 64 of planned savings will be delivered this year. I think really one of the big questions, without going back over the details again, is given the significant shortfall in the savings, so can we have confidence that the next round of savings will be delivered?
Yeah, so we've tried to take into account the challenges in both of those areas. So priority 1 have not been asked for new savings for 2018 to 19. The savings from this year will still be on the books, but we have built in some resilience into the budget. So if they are unable to replace those savings proposals, they will be expected to do that. But if there are challenges with either delivering them or replacing them, then I guess corporate finance has the capacity to provide support and to intervene and plug gaps as necessary. Priority 2, all I can do is say again, the model for which savings were put together for this MTFS is different to the model that we've used for the previous 3 financial strategies, where this time there's been a focus on chunking into demand groups, so learning disabilities, physical disabilities, / older people and mental health, and using that structure and thinking about the interventions, how they reduce demand for each of those groups, rather than having single savings lines for assistive technology or care packages, is in a way designed to overcome some of the challenges that we've had with budget setting and the delivery of savings this financial year. So I think we're in a better place. I think it's important that the committee has a sense of the wider picture. Yes, it's difficult in Haringey, but we are not alone. We're seeing huge challenges across the country, both for adults and for children, and we shouldn't forget that when we're looking at the percentage delivery of savings. We should also remember that in terms of the budget position this financial year compared to this time last financial year, we're in a much stronger position now, because the budget last financial year, despite delivery challenges, was much better constructed. So we gave more money to adults and we gave more money to children's last financial year. That's meant that they have been in a slightly more stable position than they perhaps would have been if we hadn't done that.
So, and coming back to the point which you said, which I think we've all recognised, that all councils in the country at the moment are under huge pressure, financial pressure, particularly around adult social care budgets. And we know that with, it said on page 35 that 54% of savings will be achieved, so we've got about 10 million won't be being able to achieve. What I'm really trying to work out is that if we continue to have a shortfall of a similar ilk in the following year, or maybe even just slightly less, for how long can we as a council continue to dip into our reserves to keep bolstering what are diminishing reserves with a growing need in the population? I mean, this is, as you said, not just Haringey, but this is out there for lots of councils up and down the country. But what I'm really interested in is how long do you think we've got in Haringey where we can continue to fund this extra pressure on us through the use of our reserves?
So not that long. The budget that went through to full council, essentially in the way that it's constructed, allows us to retain a general fund reserve of 15 million. It does mean that we would need to, as a council, find savings proposals for what would effectively be 2019 to 20. If I'm looking at John here, I think of between 7 to 8 million, or was it slightly higher? Yeah. In order to retain that 15 million general fund reserve. But that also assumes that we deliver savings that haven't been delivered this year and the savings that are projected for next year. And that is why this budget resilience reserve has been created, in order to protect our general fund reserve, which should remain between 3 to 5% of the gross or net budget, but also plug gaps as they appear. Fundamentally, the financial stability of this council will depend on our ability to raise local sources of income. So it will come through council tax and it will come through business rates, which is why it is fundamentally important, it is critical to the future of this council that whatever the makeup of the next administration, they are prioritising regeneration policies, because if we don't, the council will struggle to pay its way in 3, 4, 5 years down the line.
Councillor Gallagher.
Yeah, my question was on the capital budget, where there still is this massive underspend in both the general fund and the HRA. So it says in our report that most of this is expected to slip into 2018-19 financial year. I mean, can you break that down a bit? I mean, what sort of projects are we talking here? And when you say they're going to slip into the next year, can you guarantee that this spend is going to take place next year, or could there be the same uncertainty?
No, can't guarantee. Everything from the, I guess, the political makeup and direction of the council and what it chooses to prioritise, all the way to the broader economic context and the extent to which developers can make a move on certain things. These are all up for grabs. To give you one example, so Ward's Corner and the CPOs linked to that was meant to happen, I think, back in 16-17 is when we first had the line in. It then came into 17-18. It's now moved into 18-19. Obviously, we're looking to make progress on that. Is there a chance that those CPOs might slip further later down into the financial year, into the next financial year? There's the possibility, but that's about how closely we as a council work with developers to get things going. So that's just one example. You'll see that from the underspend on the general fund side, that the majority of them fall into priority 4. So our essentially our regeneration priority, and those projects are ones which I guess we have less control on than, let's say, if we're doing school build or if we are making adaptations to someone's home. We're working with partners in a much slightly more complicated way than for other priority areas, so it's hard to be firm.
Councillor Connor.
I've got a question on the disability facility grant being not spent. So that was on page 34. It said that 2 out of the 4 contractors were not appointed. So this obviously delayed the spend. Now this obviously means that people there will be going without, who fall within quite a high need. Is there somebody now overseeing that, and have more contractors are they being appointed in order to speed this up?
So I might have to go and get a bit more detail on that for you. I know there was a specific procurement problem with the team that ran that based in Woodside House, but I don't know whether we've increased from 2, so I can find out and get back to you. Yeah.
Councillor Ibrahim.
Yes, so I'm looking at priority 4 on page 34. Yeah, capital. So it's at 9.8. So just to double check that I understand this clearly. So it says Scheme 429 Strategic Acquisitions has improved by 4 million due to anticipated completion on a number of property transactions. So can you just kind of unpack what you mean by improve? Is it just because we were planning to buy them, so we were planning to acquire sites and we have? So what does that mean? So we've spent the money, and what have we spent it on? Yeah, so it looks like we've acquired some sites, but it'd be just useful to know what. That I know you won't be able to answer that. Yeah. Okay, so could I just and just a little bit on just a little bit more information, if that could just. I'm more than happy for it to be emailed to me if that's okay. Because I think acquiring sites is good. It just depends where they are and what they can be used for. And also, sorry, Scheme 438 relocation of the Civic Centre has accelerated spend by 2 million. So we've spent 2 million on, I presume that means finding another site for the, and sorry, just remind me, so has that been agreed at a particular location, or, but didn't we already own that, Woodside House?
Yeah, we do, but I think so it's part of it's like fit out of.
Oh, okay. So it's not that we've acquired the site or anything. Okay.
No, I think it's costs of refurbishing and adapting the new the place across the road, up the road. Any other points, Councillor Connor?
Just a point of clarification, just basically because I didn't understand what you've said, to be honest. So on page 36 at 11.1, the budget virament, so my understanding is that's when money moves from 11.1 on page 36 under budget viraments. So that's my understanding is when money is moved from one account to another. And it said about the one-off budget movement. And I went back to Appendix 4 where this is. So is under children's, I didn't really understand why there's a one-off. Is that a one-off payment or a one-off movement of finance from one area to another? And if so, why is one off and one is permanent? Could you just tell me exactly what that table represents? Thank you.
Okay. It is exactly as you've described. So this is just where the budgets are not set up in the way that they should be. So we're moving money around to get them to the right head. Many of these things are for technical reasons rather than policy changes. They're just to get the books structured in the right way. And some of them, as you say, have ongoing implications. Some of them have one-off implications. I don't know if you want to pick a line in particular. First one. DSG budget. Right.
Oh, right, so that's, well, the description, what's unclear?
So whether it's one-off or permanent? Yeah. Shall I give you a technical explanation outside of here on that one?
But can I use the first row as an example. What's unclear about it to you? Because I'm unclear about your question.
As I understand it, the question is why is some of it just in the year, and why does some of it affect the budgets on an ongoing basis?
Right.
And so I'll provide you an answer to that one just to illustrate that point. Yeah.
But that the first one, as you can see from the description, so our DSG allocation has changed. Thus, we've made a permanent change as a result of that. Does that make sense?
So there's a one-off payment, but actually the actual real payment, the one that actually happened, is under the permanent. Is that how I've read that correctly?
If it says permanent, and correct me if I'm wrong here, John, then that would essentially mean that the structure of that budget has shifted as opposed to an allocation.
So the one-off will be in this year, and then the permanent bit will say whether there's an ongoing effect of that going forward. So for that one, you can see in this year there's a £46.6 million adjustment, and it's slightly smaller on the budgets that will follow in subsequent years, and I don't know why it's slightly small. It's about 300k smaller, so I'll just give you an example on that one as to why that is.
It's quite interesting, that, actually. I mean, those figures are quite large, are they? And it raises some questions about budget construction, perhaps. I just don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, is your question that the budget constructed initially wasn't quite right, so we shouldn't have to make significant changes in year?
I'm just wondering whether that's actually a correct reading of what the relatively large.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends line on line. So, yeah, for example, if we're looking at the MOPAC grant funding being used to offset expenditure, versus a salary realignment where you could say perhaps you should have done better planning at the start to know that you had the correct parameters for salary. Maybe. It's hard to say. I think I wouldn't necessarily want to have an overarching conclusion as to whether it's appropriate or not. I think you've got to look at it line by line and case by case.
Joe, I just want to say, clearly this is a summary, and there's quite a lot of detail behind these, but if you get a report as members to a future meeting and there's any in advance that you want to ask for, if you give me notice, then I'll either send it to you or come here armed with that explanation so we can drill down into them.
No, that's fine. No, I was wondering more generally, really, whether you know, in your experience, these look like large amounts to be shifting around or not, and but you know, you've mentioned what the
in my Haringey experience, they're not dissimilar to the types of violence we're seeing, but I don't have any context on the level of violence in other local authorities.
Chair, you have to look at the circumstances behind it. So the single biggest one is the one which actually you picked up, which is the DSG one, the first line. So I think you'll get a better flavour as to why that's necessary, because it refers to the DSG allocation letter that we've had.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly the biggest movements are actually down to DSG rather than us, I take it, in terms of budget construction. Are there any further points on this report? Okay, thank you. Note that, and thank you for your work on bringing budget monitoring to us over the period. Thank you. Right, Councillor Blake, do you want to take the items on behalf of Councillor Hearn, which are at 13 and 14, I think?
Pages are they? 149. Page 149.
Thank you, Chair. It's very short notice, and I haven't, to be honest with you, this, although I've seen the unaccompanied asylum seeker children report, I'm just going to kind of pick up a few highlights in terms of the inquiry. I think there are a few kind of substantive issues which came to the fore through this inquiry, and I'm not sure if the recommendations reflect all of them. We did have a subsequent meeting of the scrutiny panel where we had further discussions. One of those substantive issues was our relationship with the local voluntary organisations working around this area, which I think in conclusion through the inquiry process felt fractured, to be frank. That's the word that I would use. Some of this was revolving around a major complaint in terms of officer conduct. Obviously, I'm not going to get into any of that detail because that's going through the process, the proper processes. Currently, I don't think that's been concluded. I mean, the chair would know more than I do, and maybe Rob knows more than I do. But it felt generally that we were not working as cohesively with voluntary sector partners. Particularly, I think there was some evidence that we took from officers in Islington in terms of, and certainly from those voluntary sector partners who also work in Islington and other boroughs, certainly in comparison to Islington, I certainly felt we were losing out in terms of not working as effectively and in as a collaborative fashion as I would have expected. And I think at the subsequent, the last Children and Young People Scrutiny panel meeting that we had, there was the suggestion that we really need a kind of substantive review actually involving those voluntary sector providers moving forward. So I think that's something which, if we can note that for the minutes, because I think that was minuted at the last CYP scrutiny as something that needed to happen. Obviously, in terms of the structure and approach to that will have to be agreed by the next administration after the election. Another substantive issue, again, which I'm not sure the report covers, was the relationship with the Home Office. We had a Home Office secondee, and I think the concern was that having a Home Office secondee embedded in the team was maybe contributing possibly to a more, I'll pick my words carefully here, maybe a tougher line, I think, in terms of the assessment process. Now, one of the points kind of linked to this, I think, which is important, is that through this inquiry is that a number of these children that come to our notice who don't have recourse to public funds do eventually get leave to remain. The majority do. You know, it may happen in them, 5-10 years further down the line. Certainly, personally, I felt taking an approach that, could be construed as being more harsh was actually possibly going to be counterproductive for us as a public authority, in that it could be storing us up a whole series of issues kind of further down the line. That's my personal view. Again, I think some kind of collaborative review of the position where we can hopefully repair some of these relationships with our voluntary providers, I think is absolutely essential moving forward. That's all I'm going to say. I mean, you've got the report there. We've got a full list of recommendations. But as I said, Chair, this whole issue, I think, in terms of how we work with the voluntary sector, it really, I mean, there was an anecdote from one of the voluntary sector providers who said they would send young people on their own to Islington gladly. They would never send young people on their own to our service. So I think that's a cause for concern. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to say that there isn't a recommendation there around what you're saying around voluntary sector. And I think what you suggested is right then, that's something for the panel to pick up and take forward, because it would be difficult, I think, unless there's enough sort of information here to sort of construct one. Although we could certainly, as a committee, just sort of pass on to the next iteration of the children's panel that point. On the point about the Home Office secondee, it looks to me like that arrangement is finished, actually, and it says in page 20 of the report that it's been decided not to renew it. So that, we guess, won't be an issue, a sort of ongoing issue, but the implications are as you've raised. Are there any other points from members? Councillor Connor.
This is a small point in relation to the report. I thought it was a really good report, and I was really interested to see what we were and weren't doing in relation to this. But one small thing, I mean, there's a lot of concern about children not having recourse to proper meals. And I noted here in a bracket, it says on page 169 at 310, under the Haringey team, so it says not including free school meals, so that children will always be entitled to access to education, not including free school meals. So I was wondering, is there okay, you can go straight on.
No, I think what we found was a lot of schools really going above and beyond the call of duty, really, in terms of supporting these children and trying to do it in a way that doesn't stigmatise them. But it's certainly an issue we're going to have to come back and look at again. I would reiterate my view that kind of trying to penalise these children is only likely to store us up some bigger issues in the future. So again, it's one of those things I think we really do have to kind of look in terms of our approach. There's some fantastic examples out there now, I think, of primary schools trying to provide kind of free breakfast clubs and even food banks in some schools. But we heard some testimony from head teachers and others about some really great work in terms of fundraising for young people and for families. We need to support that, and we really need to kind of think corporately, what the benefit is if you kind of take a very kind of harsh line in terms of this assessment process. So sometimes our hands are going to be tied, but I think crucially we need to be working collaboratively with our voluntary organisations. Now, I know I kind of come from somebody who spent most of their career in the voluntary sector, so I have quite a bit of sympathy, because you don't kind of rock up to your public authority partners and kind of start making complaints and saying things aren't where they should be unless you've been put in a pretty bad spot. So I think it's something we need to reflect on, and certainly something that the new administration needs to get a grip on, because Yes, so, but yeah, some great work happening out there with schools, and we've got to work closely with them and supporting them, because obviously the budgetary situation is obviously getting worse for them as well.
So just to be clear, can we in Haringey say that for this group of children we could automatically provide free school meals? Is that something we can come out of budget? There's Rob and...
It's part of their conditions is they're not entitled to free school meals, but I think what schools have been doing is giving them meals but paying for it out of their own funds. So it's not something that the schools on their own, the council on its own could do.
But we can't.
No, we can't.
We
no.
can't.
But the schools have been doing it, although they're not funded to do it.
Councillor Ibrahim.
But presumably, if a future administration decided to provide free school meals for all primary-aged children, that would presumably resolve that problem. So, I mean, can I ask? I mean, in terms of when you spoke to schools, did any of them say that would make a difference? And I suppose just to broaden that, because I'm quite interested in the question around who gets affected most by lack of free school meals, because I think people often assume that providing free school meals for all is, in a sense, subsidising wealthier children in the West. But my understanding is that if two parents work on a low wage and they're on working tax credits, they're not entitled to free school meals. And if they've got two children at primary school age, that's something like £100 a month. Three school children, you know, speaking to somebody with 3 children at primary school age, and that's like £30 a month. And I suppose there is a wider, £34 a week, therefore, not a month. So that's something like, you know, £130 a month, which is a lot of money. Are we finding in terms of use of packed lunches? Because those types of families will often think, well, we'll go and bulk buy and provide packed lunches, but often they're not the healthiest options for children, because a hot meal has got far better positive outcomes than sandwiches and, you know, crisps and things like that.
Yeah, I don't think we had, I mean, Rob will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we had a specific discussion about the proposal of free school meals across the board. Did I get that right? If I can remember.
There wasn't a discussion. I think it was just something that schools were saying, well, we're having to give these children school meals, and we do it kind of quietly and discreetly out of our own funds. I mean, depends really how many children we're talking about. If you haven't got, I don't suppose that many schools that have got significant numbers.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the wider question is a wider question. I think on that, and you know, the nature of no recourse to public funds is that they have no recourse to public funds. But and there is a recommendation relating to looking at the subsistence levels, which appear to be lower than elsewhere. So,
that's true.
So that's covered. I say the wider point on free school meals is slightly beyond this one. Lucy, you?
As kind of a parent governor rep on the kind of panel during these discussions, one of the things I wanted to kind of emphasise that came up several times in the discussions is that children of families with no recourse to public funds, and often it's the adults who are seen as having no recourse to public funds. Some of his, yes, but some of his children are actually kind of, you know, many of his children, it came up in the discussions, will actually grow up to be kind of British citizens, and that when Mark referred to that, it storing up trouble for the future, one of the things is, you know, we be creating a group of kind of future kind of Haringey adults who've had very kind of who've had kind of more stressful and deprived childhoods as a result of the kind of policies there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the basis for the support that is provided is Human Rights Act, isn't it? I think because you can't actually have a position where, children of families actually have no support whatsoever. Where have we got? So I'll take Councillor Ibrahim then.
So this is a question about, and I'm sure it's been explored, but because, whilst their parents may not have recourse to public funds, has it been explored whether they could be entitled under the Children's Act or the National Assistance Act and things like that? Has that ever been explored by different authorities, whether that would help cover things like free school meals?
I think the feedback we got from the NRPF network is that local authorities have tried virtually every means to try and get money out of central government and have so far not been successful. So possibly what's in place at the moment is the best that can be done under the current circumstances.
But I'd add to that, though. I think the discussions that we had with the voluntary sector organisations, a number of them that work in other boroughs, is that if you're working collaboratively with a local authority, in a problem-solving way, it's actually beneficial to everybody. The kind of sense I left from the inquiry was that as I said, we'd had a more harsher approach, certainly in terms of what we heard from Islington. And I don't think we were getting any benefit from that, actually. I think we're getting worse off. That was my feeling.
But I think that's my question is, sorry. I think that's kind of my question, because my concern would be that actually some of those acts, in a sense, ask the local authority to fund it from our own budgets as opposed to getting it from central government, because if you got it from central government, then obviously they would provide that to other local authorities as well. But it's whether we have a duty as a local authority to those children and whether that would come under some kind of social care responsibility. Do you know what I mean? Has that been explored, whether we actually have a duty as opposed to central government?
Rob, I don't know whether you can answer that point. I mean, and Mark actually sat on it, the panel. I mean, it's relatively thorough, and this isn't a new area, I don't think. So, I mean, I take the point that, organisations working together may be a better way of approaching this than and there isn't a recommendation in respect of looking for other routes to fund. So that, in a way, is something I think has to roll forward. But I understand the points that you're making. Yvonne, you wanted to comment?
What's happening at the church schools is that a number of them are giving a free breakfast to every single child in the school. It's coming out of the school budget to do that. So when they go to school in the morning, there's no child in school in the morning that's not had a breakfast of one sort or another. Then what happens, because of the people premium as well, some of the school meals are being paid through that, because otherwise it means, you would say a good quarter of the school would be starving. So they're actually making sure these children are actually having some form of meal. Also, quite a few of the heads have set up like a food bank. So what happens is parents, whenever they feel the need, they then go take the food into the school. There's a huge cupboard in the schools. They put the food in there. If somebody comes in, from the refugee families and says, could I have something for the children? She gives them a carrier bag and she said, go in the cupboard and help yourself. So they fill it up with food and then they go. All of that is supplied by the parents that attend the school.
So I think, having listened to what has come out of this discussion and Councillor Wright's mentioned, I think it would be really good to recommend to a future panel, if they were going to look back at this, that they do look at other recourses for funding, because what we're hearing is that schools and parents are doing their absolute best, but actually, you know, that what are we doing, and we need to step up a bit more, and maybe work with Islington and work out what exactly is going on that works. Because whilst I thoroughly applaud every school and every parent that is stepping up to this, I think it would be really good if we were taking a more proactive view. So, yeah, Councillor Blake coming here and explaining that, I think, has been very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, on that basis, can we agree the recommendations that are at page 159 and 160, and note those other points to carry forward to future work programmes? Good. Do we have the report relating to restorative justice? Sorry.
Yes, Chair. It was sent out as an addendum. I've got spare copies over here if anyone would like one.
Yeah, Councillor Blake, if you may.
Thanks, Chair. Again, this was a scrutiny day that we held here, and we had different presentations on restorative practice. And it was very much with a focus on schools, and primarily primary schools, but not exclusively. We had Chris, what's his surname? Chris Straker, who is as our sort of primary speaker. He's chief executive of a charity called Restorative Justice Council, and they lead really in terms of restorative interventions in the criminal justice system. But his background is very much in education. He's a former secondary school head teacher in Hull and in other cities, and he's very much taken with this concept around restorative practice for schools, which is, I think, a little bit different from the kind of restorative justice panel-type interventions that, for example, our youth offending service has to take forward as part of their statutory orders. So it's very much looking at approaches around behaviour management which are more collaborative, more reflective with children, and less of the kind of binary type behaviour policies which majority of schools have sort of adopted. So we had some good presentations on the day. I think we all left the day very enthused, and we've got a number of recommendations here. I'm not going to pick up on all of them, but I think we all kind of, in terms of the first recommendation, we all really kind of felt that restorative practice on a number of different fronts in terms of strategy and development of services for young people in the borough was something that we need to see a lot more of. We had a fantastic presentation from, was it from the primary school? It was a primary school presentation, wasn't there? Or am I getting mixed up with something else? That's right, from Deborah Tucker. Yeah, sorry, from Deborah Tucker, who spoke about some of our primary schools who've been utilising these approaches. So that's it, Chair. I think this is something for the next administration to kind of look at and to take forward. But I think particularly in the context of the kind of youth violence issues which are kind of rising to the fore in the borough and across London, practices that can actually enable children and young people to resolve conflict in a way where they reflect, where they talk to each other, I think are absolutely crucial. So this is one pillar, I think, in terms of those kind of early intervention and prevention approaches that we need to build on. Thanks.
Thanks. So it's a clear report, and it's looked like a good day as well. Don't know, do people have any comments, or are we happy to agree the recommendation report and the recommendations on page 2? Happy with that?
Yep.
Good. Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, Finsbury Park update. Finsbury Park events update, I should say. Page 49. Okay, this is the regular update on this one. I don't know if you want to just highlight where we're at on current progress. So we're looking at page 55. Is there anything to highlight particularly?
Okay, thank you, Chair. This has been reported back to the committee before, and this report, as you say, is just an update. I mean, there's been good progress on all the recommendations, except perhaps where it was asked that the officers explore longer-term contracts for events in Finsbury Park. There's been some research done around that, but due to the sort of ongoing legal challenges, that hasn't been progressed. But otherwise, all the recommendations have been rolled out, part of working practice, for example, the regular stakeholder meetings, very successful, happen before the events and regularly throughout the year, how the money's spent, including the environmental impact fee, which is used for small community group activity, and really, unless there's any questions, you know, from the perspective of the recommendations, things are going really well.
Councillor Gallagher.
Thanks. Just a couple of questions. Firstly, on the environmental impact fee, I'm sorry I didn't make the last stakeholders meeting, so it may have been discussed there, but what's the process for agreeing how that's going to be spent for this year? Because I think the things listed in the report relate to the previous year. And the second was recommendation 11, which talks about developing a recovery action plan after each event. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything as kind of comprehensive as an action plan, and I think there have been problems in previous years of the park not being repaired as speedily as we would like. So what actually is the process, and is there this action plan that's put in place and shared with councillors and residents, for example?
Well, in terms of the environmental impact fee, after the event season, the amount, which this year was 35,000 approximately, is taken to the stakeholder group, and basically projects are asked for. And the stakeholders, there's no sort of application process as such. They simply write an email, forward their ideas. It's discussed in the stakeholder group, and then there's a process of agreeing it. And generally speaking, everything is agreed. There's been some things that have been raised, such as, for example, making improvements to the toilet and the CAF, which is being deemed to be not something that the environmental impact fee should be spent on, and that the parks budget will deal with that. In terms of around the recovery plan, what happens after the event is that the events team and the parks team, and sometimes there's councillors with them at this time, do a tour the park and basically formulate a list of the various things that need to be fixed. And it's costed up, and then the work has progressed. In recent times, money's been spent on better equipment and so on to, you know, do a better job of it, basically. And some this year as well, we're getting some more advice, some more expert advice around grass restoration, which will hopefully, you know, very much improve that aspect of things. So I'm not sure. I'd have to check as to, you know, that plan and how is it circulated and all the rest of it, and if I could get back to you on that. Yeah.
Councillor Mitchell, welcome to the Scrutiny Committee.
Yeah. I was just going to add on that final point that we've commissioned the Sports Turf Research Institute to advise on restoration of areas that get high footfall. So hopefully that will make a difference. I don't know, but they sound very impressive, so they should know what they're doing.
I mean, my presumption is that it's a type of company that deals with football pitches, isn't it? So it's sports turf or, yeah. Hopefully we're not going to be talking about AstroTurf, though I remember that was mentioned once.
So can I just ask, I've been told that there's been a tractor being bought? Six-figure sum, or was that just something that I've heard and not? So what exactly does this tractor do? And is it just for Finsbury Park, or does it go to other parks and do other things, whatever it does there? And another question I was, so what money has actually been raised in the last year? I did see some figures, but I wasn't sure if that was the totality, 8.3 on page 51. It sets out an increase of 600,000 of income during the period up to March. But is that the money that these events in Finsbury Park has raised, or is that on top of other monies? And can I ask, is this money raised from the Finsbury Park event, ring-fenced to Finsbury Park, or is it at the moment being spent on other parks and upkeep?
In terms of how the money is spent, the income from Finsbury Park events, so there is one outcome of the legal action was that the council accepted that the 1906 Act, I think it is, applied, and therefore that we hold the park in trust for the public, and therefore it is accepted that the income has to be spent within Finsbury Park. Yeah. So we will be publishing information to account for how that income is allocated.
So basically all the money that's just the new legal action. I'll let Councillor Mitchell explain that. But it's just to be really clear, that so from now on, or was this retrospective? So I'm assuming it's not retrospective, but from now on, all the money raised from the events in Finsbury Park will just be ring-fenced to providing, to update, you know, sort of the budget for the parks in Finsbury Park. So where would that, and if that's true, where would that leave us regarding the budget for the other parks upkeep?
So I'm reading from the Cabinet member signing, which I appreciate you may not have in front of you, but that was a public document. So the Cabinet member signing was last Thursday, where I signed off the major events for Finsbury Park for this coming year. And that stated that, and I quote, all income generated through events specifically held in the park will be spent in the park as required under the Open Spaces Act 1906. And it goes on to give more detail on that.
Yeah, there was another question about a tractor.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that
in a
second. Yeah, so Councillor Gallagher.
Let me just say,
On the Environment Scrutiny Panel, we've just conducted quite a wide-ranging review on parks that I think we'll be reporting on shortly. And we looked in detail at the funding situation, and certainly our understanding was that income from events was spent in all parks, and the parks budget as a whole very much depends on that income. And if it was ring-fenced for Finsbury Park, the money simply wouldn't be available for other parks. I'm aware that there was that ruling from the court judgment, but I think my understanding was that that was being contested by the council, but I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything since then that's different.
Councillor, yeah.
I mean, my question is a follow-on to Tim's. Are we contesting that judgment?
So, the Court of Appeal largely rejected the challenge, of course, but I'm find the right place. There was a question raised about the application of this 1906, the Open Spaces Act 1906, and that point was accepted by the council. Okay. Yeah.
So,
well, hang on.
No, my follow-up. No, my question was, well, how will the budget going to be spent?
Yeah, well, you've asked that question.
No,
so
in the other parks.
No, I know you've asked that question, and Councillor Gallagher has alluded to it as well. So I'll take Councillor.
So my question is similar. Does Finsbury Park need £600,000 to be spent on it? Because that just seems.
So, again, in the report to the Cabinet member signing last week, it does state that in terms of that income, in the first instance, this will assist with the management and maintenance costs associated with running the park, and any surplus income would then be used to make improvements to the park's infrastructure. So that's what we've stated as the consequence of the interpretation of this 1906 Act.
So I think the broader question then is that if the budget was predicated on the general parks budget was predicated on income from Finsbury Park, then the budget needs to be looked at again, because money which would otherwise have been accrued from Finsbury Park events can't now be spent anywhere other than Finsbury Park, I take it.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but we will also be using that income to cover the normal management and maintenance costs. So that will, to some extent, ease the overall parks allocations.
Sorry, does it cost that much to make improvements to the park, manage its maintenance, etc.? If it does, fair enough. If it doesn't, and there's still a surplus, what do we do with that money?
There is a large expenditure at Finsbury Park, and you know, it's got the most staff of any of the other parks. There's quite a bit of management around it as well. Talking about how will the money be spent? Well, quite a bit will be spent just on operational stuff, and then there are some quite substantial, long-standing works that need doing. For example, a minimum of $300,000 will need to be spent over the next few years on upgrading the play park. There's the public safety works that will be needed over the next few years in terms of lighting and, making the park safer. So, there is a lot of work to be done in Finsbury Park, and there's a whole exercise at the moment, just working through the budgets. It's a big piece of work, but it's happening at the moment, and in a few weeks' time it'll become clear where the divisions are. The parks still run at, there's still a subsidy in the parks budget. So, it probably will, or it may well come out in the wash that you know, the income made at Finsbury Park will, you know, clearly support the activity that goes on at Finsbury Park, and then the subsidy will need to support the other parks' operations, the existing subsidy. Now, it's not for me as an officer to work out how, you know, the wider budget questions, but, you know, there may well need to be more support for the parks going forward. I'm not sure. To be ascertained, as I say, that piece of work's been done at the moment.
Okay, I mean, the points have been made. I think I don't know how far we can take this apart from. Well, I think there's a clear implication, you know, of what happens there. But it's nothing. It would be hard for us to do anything, I think, other than to add or to make a recommendation that position is looked at closely, I think, unless anyone wants to firm that up a bit. Councillor Connor.
I'd like to firm that up. I'd really think about the parks review that's just been done and the strain and stress on providing. We're actually, I mean, Councillor Gallagher's done a report where he's actually looking for the health, public health and CCG to try and fund different things within the park. So I would ask that we get a very clear report as to what this budget is, where it's going to be spent, and the problems that may occur in other parks without this extra money coming into them. So is the budget that is left able to support the other parks in the borough? And I'm just wondering if you could possibly give us some sort of timeline for that sort of report to be put together. It won't obviously be coming to us, but it'll be coming to the next administration. But it'd be really useful to have some sort of time when those questions come out. Councillor Gallagher will probably have other recommendations to add into that. But for me, because if we're holding all these events, well, we might then only need to hold half of them. If we're only spending half the money, we don't need to have all these. We don't need 20 events if actually 10 events will give us the money to cover the costs ongoing for Finsbury Park if we can no longer use that money. So that tension really needs to be unpicked. And I'm just wondering, as you're the officer here, with a Cabinet member present, is there any way of giving us some indication of when that could be put together and come back to a scrutiny committee?
Well, I mean, I think your points are well made, Councillor Colliver. I mean, I'm not in a position to give any commitments for what the new administration might be doing. No, indeed. I mean, I think you're right. This is a relatively new legal point. It arose from the Court of Appeal decision in November. And so, you know, it is early days in terms of what are the full implications both for Finsbury Park and, as you've said, you know, for the wider parks budget across the borough. So, you know, officers are working on that, but I can't commit to what the new administration might do in terms of bringing forward a report and looking at those issues.
I was going to check with Councillor Gallagher whether the recommendations that we're going to come to from the review of parks cover this, and I think not explicitly as far as I can see, and B, would an additional recommendation to those recommendations be the right place to make these points, so that it would go forward to, you know, the first available cabinet after May to respond with these points explicitly made along with the other recommendations.
So I think on the basis of what we'd heard, I would certainly like to make an additional recommendation, because I don't think this is covered in the current report. And although we were never given exact figures for breakdowns of what is spent in each park, my understanding has always been that a lot more has been raised through events than is actually spent in Finsbury Park. So if it is the case that money raised through events can only be spent in Finsbury Park, That means we now have a considerable hole in the park's budget. I'm not sure if that was the Friends of Finsbury Park's intention, but that seems to have been the outcome of this court hearing. So that clearly has very serious implications, not least because our kind of principal finding throughout this review is that the park's budget, as it is in trouble, and we are not funding parks as we should be. So, I mean, we'll come on to the report, I suppose, in a second, but absolutely there needs to be an additional recommendation.
I'll take Councillor Carter then, yeah, if you want to. So I can't see too well with these. If you want to make a quick point on this one.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, Councillor Connor asked a little earlier a little question about a very big tractor. Now, this tractor, I have seen it on. This is about huge expenditure, Chair, in Finsbury Park that I know of. I should declare an interest. I am a trustee of the Friends of Finsbury Park. We are quite a large outfit. We've got between 400 and 500 members. This huge tractor cost, I think it was a six-figure sum. I have in mind either £250,000 or £350,000. It's an enormous beast. I just wonder if we could get some confirmation of what it actually cost, what it's used for, and how often it is used, because it just seems like an enormous expense to me. Thank you.
Well, so that was a question asked earlier, which I've still got down to be answered. So can we answer that one at this stage, or perhaps come back to the council?
I do recall being told about this tractor, but I don't have information here, and I honestly can't recall precisely. I don't think I was told the cost. I can't recall precisely the full reasons as to why this was a good move, but I will come back to you with some further information about that.
Yeah, I mean, machinery is not cheap always, but yeah, we'll get an answer on that one coming back. Okay, so if there's nothing specifically more around the review of the update on the Finsbury Park events. Sorry.
Do you live in the borough? Either of you? You both do. And you live near Finsbury Park? You live near Finsbury Park? For the simple reason I'm asking, because the clean-up is only in the park. All the condoms and all the faeces and everything that's dumped in the gardens along the side street and down the other one, the residents have to do that. One of my sons lived along there and he couldn't take it. It took 2 years of that awful noise, day and night. And consequently, what happened? He sold up and moved. Why should we have to move when you're putting these kind of things on in the park that's stopping us going to the park in the afternoons when we want to go? And weekends is the ideal time for people to go there, especially now spring is starting in. You take up all the spring, all the summer and all the autumn, and that's totally unfair. And I don't know where the council is to allow you to do that, because you're depriving us something that belongs to the people anyway.
Well, I mean, yeah, no, that's a general point. I'm not sure Councillor Mitchell is you know, that policy. No, I know, I know, and one of the reasons we've run this review and had the updates is precisely to address those sort of issues, you know, year on year. As I say, I mean, actually, one of the implications of the funding position, I think, would be a review of the major events policy in respect of Finsbury Park, as we've already covered. But as I say, we're not specifically looking at whether that policy goes forward or not at this stage. Councillor.
Sorry, can I just make a point here, though? It has improved. So over the last couple of years, since the set-up of the stakeholder group, I mean, you know, we used to, obviously because the park is in Haringey Ward, we used to get loads of complaints about it. I think that actually since the stakeholder group has been set up, since those conversations have become far more positive, actually I think that we are getting less complaints to the same degree as we used to. And I just think that, you know, I think I think officers have been listening, and I think the reality is that, you know, there are a number of questions at play here. That is the use of public spaces, for whether you want to define it as art or whether you want to define it as you know, noise. That's, you know, but for different people it means different things, and it's an important aspect of the culture of London as well. But I think at the same time it does have to be balanced out with people who live in the surrounding area. But I've always said, look, I lived in Finsbury Park in 1986, opposite the park, and there were concerts there. This is not something new. It's just how we manage it. And I think the reality is if it's only going to have to be spent on the park, then perhaps, you know, there should be a reduction in events. However, at the same time, I think we have to accept that, you know, other parks need funding, and actually we're going to have to find that from alternative means. And whilst I'm sure the Friends of Finsbury Park, you know, obviously will be happy about the outcome, I think this is a broad point about Friends of all parks as well. And we, you know, I think Haringey is one thing. You know, people will say I'm often quite critical about stuff, but actually you know, I've seen boroughs who've privatised their parks, who've, you know, outsourced the management of them, etc. So I think actually we have to have an honest conversation about, you know, having to balance out the fact that we've got events and we need to fund those parks by some means, because, you know, we've got dwindling budgets.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point, and that's the approach we've broadly taken through this. And I think the figures and the updates do show that things have improved. I don't know whether we need to say any more on Finsbury Park events specifically, then, other than to note the update, unless Councillor Mitchell wants to say something.
Well, just briefly in response to the points made about the impact on local residents. I mean, I'd refer you to the papers that went to the Cabinet member signing last week, which are available online, because it does set out in some detail our responses to the various representations that were received, and it also sets out very much increased efforts to deal with any antisocial behaviour and litter and so on, including a huge increase in stewarding in neighbouring roads, residential roads. And a focus on cleaning up not just the streets but actually front gardens as well if necessary. And it also sets out the full programme of events that were approved, and in line with the Council's policy, of course, there are no events held during the summer holidays, the school holidays, so you know, the whole of the park is available for the whole of that time. And indeed, even for the major events, the papers set out what proportion of the park is used for those events. And so it also makes the point that significant areas of the park remain available for wider use. Thanks.
Thanks. So if nothing else on Finsbury Park specifically, the points that we've made in relation to the use of the income, the revenue, and that, and implications, if we can pick up during the discussion, we'll go on to now on item 12, which is the scrutiny review on parks. So, Councillor Guy, do you want to?
Thank you. So, just to sum up, this was a wide-ranging review into parks and open spaces in Haringey. We worked very closely with Dave Morris, representing Friends of Parks Forum. We spoke to other Friends groups. We spoke to the Fields in Trusts and Parks for London, and the panel also went on a couple of visits. So the main areas we were looking at were standards of maintenance in parks, funding for parks, and also protection from inappropriate development or commercialisation. So if I could just highlight some of the key findings. I think the first thing to stress is that everyone we spoke to was highly complimentary about Haringey's park service, but there was a recognition that it is very stretched, and that came from park users and from officers alike. And that simply maintenance levels are not sufficient in their current state. So we've been very honest about that in the report. We recognise, of course, that all services are stretched, and we are not calling for funds to be kind of dispersed from other parts of the council's budget, but we think we do need to place that on record that the Park Service needs considerably more funding. So we believe, and this came from a recommendation from Haringey Parks Forum, that the aspiration should be that each park has its own dedicated member of staff. At the moment there is a much more fragmented system, but for parks, or at least parks whose size warrants it, we felt that that would be the best way of maintaining parks. We think that we should be looking to obtain green flag status for as many of our parks as possible, and we also felt that the borough's position should be that parks should become a statutory service, providing that was accompanied by sufficient funding and minimum standards. And then just on the final point about protection from development and from commercialisation, one of our witnesses was the Fields in Trust, who placed parks under covenant, which is a stronger form of protection than metropolitan open land, and we have argued that all parks should be placed under this covenant. If I could just add on the basis of what we've heard this evening, because I think this does change things, and as I said, my understanding is that if this is correct, then there will be less funding available to other parks in Haringey beyond Finsbury Park. So I think the first thing that we need, and I think this should be the recommendation, is that we need very clear sums on how much money is derived from events, very clear sums on how much is spent on Finsbury Park. So essentially we can work out what that difference is, and then a clear plan needs to be put in place for where that revenue is going to come from. And other committee members may have other ideas, but I think that's the key point that needs to be added as an additional recommendation.
Right. No, it's a good report. Members' comments or additions in respect of what we've just been talking about? Councillor Connor.
No, I think that's going to be really needed, because I think there was a look at getting some money from sort of public health and CCG, and whilst I completely agree and understand that parks have a huge health benefit and a huge mental health benefit to people, I just knowing that the CCG budget is overspent at the moment and public health is so tight, I can't see that we're going to get any money from them. So I agree with your recommendation about how we're going to find out what money we're going to basically lose from the other parks by the money now being ring-fenced into Finsbury Park, with those Finsbury Park events, money just staying in Finsbury Park. I think that's going to be key, because we don't want to suddenly lose staff. And you made the recommendation about having one key member of staff per park, which again, you know, that would be really great. But you know, I think now we've got a slight concern around the budget. So, and I think so. When sort of are you looking for that recommendation will go to cabinet? Is that?
This report will go to cabinet, sort of in, you know, when it can be timetabled to cabinet. What we'll do tonight is approve the recommendations and approve the submission of the report to cabinet in due course. Councillor Ibrahim.
I suppose my worry is that with what's just been said about the ring fencing of the money for Finsbury Park, to Finsbury Park, that you might end up in a situation where more parks have to have events in them in order to kind of increase the budget elsewhere. So where you've got parks that aren't necessarily used for events, you might end up in a situation that actually you end up spreading the issue of events in parks, because I think we're seeing more and more events at Duckett's Common anyway, aren't we? And places like, you know, the White Hart Lane Rec, and so yeah, possibly comment. Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I think that's in a sense that is going to be the worry.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, Finsbury Park, like you've said, is a large park which has had those events over years. I mean, that would suggest that the recommendations might include, you know, to look at the events policy,
yeah.
Or is that implicit within the?
No, I think we should say
looking at the implications of the Finsbury Park.
Can I just?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm sure that is the next step. But I think if the events policy is going to be looked at from the beginning, I mean, that's a whole separate area. I'm not sure that's necessarily the recommendation in this report.
I think
yeah. I mean, it's clearly implicit in looking at, you know, the division of revenue pursuant to the yeah. Happy with that? I don't know whether. Yeah, but, are we happy with that as a way forward on that? And we agree the recommendations as written as well, which are a good set of recommendations on page 123 and 124. Happy with that? Good, thank you. I did actually skip to that one because it followed on so well from Finsbury Park without saying that's what without asking the committee whether that would be appropriate. So we'll go back to item 11, review of social housing. Councillor Ibrahim.
So this is a review that we started at the beginning of the year, and it's obviously something that we wanted to spend the most of this time doing, following on from the two big projects we did on the Haringey development vehicle. So what we thought would be a good thing to do is actually it wasn't just connected to that, it was because social housing has just become such a huge debate in the local, national, you know, political sphere, that, especially post-Grenfell, we thought it would be really, really important at this point in time to actually just do as broad a research piece as possible on what we see as the future of social housing, whether it's in Haringey or elsewhere, and speak to as many people as possible. So if you look to the last page, you'll see the list of people we spoke to, and it's quite a long list, and it's quite a good list as well. So what I would say is anybody in the social media, in the social housing world, you know, kind of agreed to come and speak to us. We started it off with a film showing of Dispossession, and that kind of set the agenda in terms of what we were going to be exploring. And over the period of the months and after speaking to all of those people, we never do 7 or 8 recommendations. We come up with 26, I believe. But they're also subheadings as well. So we've got 26 recommendations, and some of those are broken down into A, Bs and Cs as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations because there are so many, but I'm going to pull out some of the really significant ones, and that was... and this is something that has received a lot of debate as well. We think that the council can establish a wholly owned development company to start building housing, but that's not the only solution. It has to be a combination of approaches. So in a sense, I mean, I think Zena would probably, who's in the room, would probably agree with this terminology, that it's about horses for courses and what works for specific circumstances. But to target to build 1,000 council homes, which we believe can be built by the council by 2022, but through a combination of direct build and a wholly owned development vehicle. So you can actually directly build homes, but you can also do them through a wholly owned vehicle because of your ability to borrow at higher levels and not be affected by caps. But also within that, we thought it was really important not to forget that that's actually only part of the picture, and that we have to be really, really firm on affordability targets for developments, because of course there'll be developments that aren't built by the council. So, I mean, I suppose what we want to do is kind of kind of destroy this myth that this is, you know, not going to build 6,500, but it's going to only build 1,000. Actually, that figure is a combination of what the developers and what, you know, in terms of affordability targets, that would be within that figure. So we're saying that the 1,000 homes will be directly built by the council or the development vehicle, and which is wholly owned, but that we enforce affordability targets at a much stronger level at 50%, because that's really important in terms of what was changed by this council to bring it down to 40. Now, we realise that after those, once those kind of proposals come forward, then, you know, you may end up with slightly less than 50%. But to start with the aim of getting, not to start from the zero and negotiate up, but to start from 50 and negotiate down. So if you start from the highest starting point, you're actually in a far better negotiation position. But also, it's important not to allow that to be a fudge in terms of market rents and the percentage as well. So it's all well and good saying to somebody, well, you know, a developer comes and says, well, yeah, we can develop 50% affordability, but all of them are at 80% market rent, because that's not really helpful in terms of our own targets and what we want to come forward. So to have some kind of threshold within that 50% or whatever's agreed in the end, of which only a maximum number of those can be at that top end of 80%. So that makes sure that whilst you're getting the affordability targets, it's actually, you're being realistic about genuine affordability as well. So recommendation 4, we also talk about a variety of other different approaches that could be part of a broader picture. But also, we also wanted to be a bit stronger on how we believe affordability mixes are not necessarily what we expect them to be on the packet. So, for example, student housing being able to be classed by developers as affordable housing. We were recommending that the council set in place a local policy which does not consider student housing to contribute towards the affordability mix. Yeah, fine, build it, but it's not part of the affordability mix, because it's a very different, I hate using the word product. It's a very different, you know, and also the recommendation 6 talks about the different sized properties and a bigger focus on family-sized homes, because Haringey historically has a problem that a huge percentage of, I think around 50% of our not social homes, council homes are one-bedrooms, and actually that means that we really don't have enough homes at 2 or 3 bedroom to meet our waiting list demands. So we really want to be saying to developers, and when we develop and when we build ourselves, the focus being on not the number of units, but the bedroom sizes. Sorry, not bedroom sizes, bedroom numbers. And I'm just trying to pick and choose some other recommendations because we've got so many. Also, use of the capital budget to bring council homes up to decent home standards as soon as possible. So only 75% of our homes are at decent home standards. This was part of our key kind of terms of reference, and I should have really gone through our terms of reference at the start, and I do ask people to have a look at that. So what we were looking at is people's experience of living in social housing and council homes, whether it be homes for Haringey or with housing associations, and how residents feel that they're being treated, how they're viewed, how they're perceived by society. And one of the biggest questions that came out of the tragedy of Grenfell was how lots of residents did not feel that they were listened to, and it's very small things that actually make social housing tenants feel that they're valued, and part of that is maintaining homes, is repairs, absolutely. So if they need something fixed and it takes 6 months to get it done, then that's not something that actually makes those tenants feel valued. And and one of the other recommendations was around again types of homes that we define as affordable. Now, recommendation 9, so we had to kind of slightly adjust that a little bit. However, we felt that there are certain sized homes, which I won't name, which are defined as affordable, but they are at the very minimum of the livability standards recommended by the GLA, and we feel that whilst those types of homes are defined as affordable, we should not be selling our public land to those developers for them to define it as affordable. And this is to do with certain sizes of homes that I'm not going to name, pocket living. So we also made a range of recommendations around lobbying central government. So they're not necessarily recommendations for things that we can do something about, but actually we think it's important that we should be a campaigning council on the issue of social housing, and that's having a bigger voice on being at the forefront of demanding the removal of the debt cap on the housing revenue account, councils retaining right to buy receipts and using them to build replacement housing, and various recommendations around that. And also recommendation 21, which talks about being proactive in terms of our local policies around planning, and again that goes into more information about what we should do about improving our affordability targets. And so I move on to page 84, which has got another 4 recommendations. And I think I'd like to direct you all to recommendation 25, A, B and C, which has been broken down. I mean, we felt that there is a disconnect between the role of scrutiny on the council and the role of scrutiny on Homes for Haringey, and actually I think that there needs to be a point at which we're working towards the same purpose, because actually a lot of the time when we're scrutinising housing, we're not hearing from the residents, we're not hearing from the tenants. And when we went to meet with the residents panel, which Yvonne very kindly met with us, it was quite difficult for both sides to understand what each other's role was. And actually, I think there needs to be, even if it's perhaps twice a year, not necessarily quarterly in terms of the way we meet, is that if there was some kind of process by which we actually hold meetings together so that we can hear from residents more so that the council scrutiny process does not feel as remote from Homes for Haringey scrutiny process as it does at the moment. And actually, what was interesting was when we went to meet with the residents, they didn't know, with the residents panel, they didn't strictly know what our role was, and we didn't necessarily know what theirs was either. But it was important to have that conversation. And recommendation 26, a full consultation should be undertaken with residents of estates prior to any decision being taken in respect of estate regeneration. The consultation should also include a ballot of all residents and leaseholders on any affected estate. So this is a, this isn't controversial. It's about making sure that any consultation includes a ballot. It's not either one or the other. It should be conversations and a ballot. So, and they should obviously work side by side with each other, because I think many of us will agree just having a ballot isn't going to provide you with an adequate level of consultation for people to be understanding what they're voting on, but at the same time people should have that final say. So that's why those two things were brought together into a single recommendation. And I just want to refer people back to number 7, which is something that we felt quite strongly about actually, which a feasibility report to be produced into the development of an in-house project team of architects, urban planners and other professionals to help improve quality and supply. Now this may seem outlandish in the current climate, because the idea is, councils don't have in-house architects. But yes, they do. We don't. There are councils who still have in-house architects. They're very few and far between now, but they do exist. And actually, looking at ways, because what we're always, and it's very understandable when officers come back and say to us, look, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the expertise to be delivering this type of work. Actually, because that's dwindled over the years, and we have to start somewhere. If we're going to end a culture of spending vast amount of money commissioning out this type of work, and actually one of the questions that we're always asking is the amount of money we spend on consultants, because actually we need to buy that expertise in. If we don't, then actually we can't deliver some of our targets. So the reality is that unless we start exploring building kind of in-house capacity, which there are other councils in London that do have that, then we are always going to be in a position where we're spending vast amounts of money on that type of work, which is very specialist. So I welcome any questions.
Councillor Gallagher.
Thank you. It's a really good report, and I admire its sort of breadth and ambition. Just a couple of questions. Is there a potential contradiction between 3C and 20? So 3C says only a limited proportion should be at the top end of 80%, and then 20 says that council should make a commitment that affordable housing should be set at social rent levels, which implies that it all needs to be, so all affordable housing should be social. Do you want to look at that first, and I'll come back with other questions?
Look at the specific wording.
Any other questions immediately? Well, are you on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we have to recognise is that these are aspirations. So what we recognise is that the reality is that should be a long-term commitment. However, that's not going to happen overnight. So we don't want to be in a situation where we look at developments that come forward and say immediately that no, that's not classified as affordable because it's 80%. So I think obviously this is like 26 recommendation, and for me number 20 is where we should be in, say, 7, 8, 10 years' time. I mean, the idea that, you know, the next cabinet is going to look at those recommendations and say, oh yeah, we can do that overnight is not realistic. So for me, there is no immediate contradiction because all of this is aspirational.
I think the wording might need to be clarified a little bit, because essentially you're saying that 3C is a recommendation you're expecting the Cabinet to adopt immediately, but 20 is an aspiration. So I think maybe that needs to be clarified.
I think they both need to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but you can accept a recommendation. It doesn't mean you adopt it immediately. Yeah, because that's what it is. It's a recommendation, and that's what you... I mean, we could say the long-term commitment of the Council is that... Yeah, just add long-term. Yeah. That's fair enough.
And just a couple of other points. I mean, there's a few things in here about lobbying central government and seeking to change legislation. I think you used the expression campaigning council, which is certainly admirable, and I think we should have been doing more of that. But on the other hand, you know, what does that mean in practice? And is there evidence of councils actually managing to change national legislation with a Tory government through lobbying?
When I say it's not just, I mean, campaigning isn't just lobbying, and I think we need to be stronger about our kind of political commitment to changing that. And I think we have seen campaigns in the 80s which saw severe challenges to central government, particularly when we saw, you know, some of the campaigns that were run by the GLC at the time as well. I just think we need to not be having that, not be lobbying in closed rooms with government ministers. We actually need to be standing out there on the street with our banners and having some kind of communication strategy around that. Because I think actually, you know, this council is very good at promoting a positive image, and has some very, very good and very highly skilled communication staff. And I think that can be put to really, really positive use around political kind of steer and political campaigning around challenging. And that's not party political, by the way. It doesn't have. I think, you know, a lot of these issues cross party political boundaries, particularly on that. So, just for the chair to, I can see you've got your hand up. Yeah.
Just one more question, Chair. Can I just ask another question in a minute?
Oh, sorry.
Just one final question, which is around ballots. And I accept the argument for ballots, and obviously it's Labour Party policy now, but I think there is a tension with ballots between the immediate needs of the tenants living in that estate at any given moment and what the council perceives as being the greater good, not just for people across the borough, but also for many years to come. So, and you know, I've heard you speak against ballots in the past during the HDV review. Are you convinced that that is the way forward, and that though that tension that I've referred to is not going to be a major problem?
I've always been dubious about ballots as a sole part of a consultation. That's why we've put it in as part of a combined, because I think you can't, and this is why I was very, very clear, you can't have a consultation without a ballot, but you also can't have a ballot without a consultation, and I think they should work together. And but I don't necessarily think there is a contradiction between balloting current residents and managing the responsibilities we have to people on our waiting list, and I think this is a broader philosophical question, is this idea that actually what we've got to be telling people on our estates is that we need to house more people here. You all have to squeeze in together, you know, and make space for each other. And in fact, you have to squeeze in more together, and we've got to build some market homes to make sure that you can stay there and more people can live there. Actually, I think that, for me, is a dubious argument. I think the reality is we should have more truck with the idea that actually when people vote on whether their estate should be regenerated or you know, whether or not, or whether they don't support that, that they will actually consider the broader aims of that, because then we promote this idea, which is part of the broader narrative around social housing, that actually those people living in council houses are lucky, and secondly, they're selfish, and that actually all they're thinking about is their own immediate interests. And that, for me, is part of the broad kind of negative narrative that has been there around social housing since perhaps the mid-1980s, 90s onwards. And what we were specifically concerned, or what we were specifically trying to kind of look into, and where we heard a lot of evidence, is how social housing used to be perceived and how social housing tenants were seen in the past, and it was not seen as housing for the most vulnerable. That doesn't mean it isn't for the most vulnerable. However, it was not only for the most vulnerable, you know, and I think we spoke about our own experiences of growing up in social housing, and, you know, it wasn't seen as a, you know, estates weren't seen as sink estates. That was language that came much later on, and it was seen as a positive experience. And we saw, particularly in the documentary that we started off with, how the percentage of people who live in social housing has so dramatically shifted over the last 40 to 50 years, where I think something like, you know, below 10%, much below that, I can't remember the exact figure, of people now live in social housing, and that, you know, there are multiple reasons for that. But coming back to your issue about ballots, is, yes, I do think it, you know, we obviously have to take into account the broader aims of the council, and that's why that specific recommendation, which, you know, I feel strongly about, should be part of a consultation, not one or the other.
I really like this report. So I think you know that our position is on that we really like the council-owned, wholly owned development vehicle idea, which has come out strongly in your report. I'm very much of the thing that we should have as a council the ability to own our own profits and decide on our own levels of social housing. I really don't like the genuine or the affordable housing thing that we have at the moment, which, as you said, is pretty high, usually 80%. That really does not tie into any level of income that I would call the average person, you know, teachers, and we have said this before, many occasions, but they just can't own and they just can't afford. So I really like your aspirations for reducing and having genuinely affordable housing in that. So I have to say, I mean, it was great, no poor doors, which is recommendation number 2. No, I know, but that's basically what it is. And to be honest, that's kind of how people view it. So I'm really pleased that that's been addressed and you termed it differently. And the things about the high-rise blocks having sprinklers retrofitted, again, really important, just for people's safety and perception of safety. I'm going to play devil's advocate just on 2 points. One is that when we put out the council-owned, wholly owned development vehicle, people kept saying, well, why the right to buy? Because we develop, you know, we build council homes, social housing, and then, of course, you know, the question is, will people just buy them and then we'll be left in a similar position? I know you've got an answer to that. And sheltered housing, that's often counted as so, and that really gets me as well, because that's, again, as you said, that's a different, you know, you were saying about one of the other characteristics not being, students not being counted. Things like sheltered housing, we shouldn't, because that's for health reasons and different reasons. So again, if we could remove that from the figures, that would be really great, actually. And then I think we would get a really genuine feel on that. So just really on the right to buy thing, but I have to say the rest of the report I thoroughly agreed with, so thank you.
So on the right to buy, I don't think it's always a legitimate question, because obviously it's quite difficult when councils spend money building homes for them to then be being sold for a right to buy. I think I've always had the view that it's a slight red herring, because the reality is that homes that are newly built for people on our waiting list, because at the moment, because of the nature of priority need, the reality is that those people who are going to be moving into those homes are not going to be able to buy those homes for at least a generation. Okay, so it's not an immediate concern for me around the homes that we build now, and it doesn't really change the fact that actually a lot of our homes, I think, and I'm not 100% sure on this, that are going through right to buy are children buying for their parents homes which they probably, have been living in for 30 to 40 years. So that it won't solve that problem. And ultimately, the big debate on the Haringey development vehicle was because it was a 50-50 partnership, could it potentially? And the answer is, on the wholly owned, it's not 100% sure that you couldn't sell it, but the same goes for a 50-50 partnership as well. Look, the government moves the goalposts all the time on this, so there is no right or wrong answer on right to buy, but the reality is, I think, homes that we would be building over the next few years, the people that you will be moving into those. Now, it's different, because I know some issues were raised at the last scrutiny panel, Housing and Regen scrutiny panel meeting, about homes that had recently been built and then there'd been an immediate application for right to buy. But that's through a transfer. So even if you transfer between properties, if you've been a tenant, you don't lose your right to buy just because you've recently, moved through a transfer. And obviously, the person that would have transferred to that would have vacated another property. So I don't think it's an immediate issue, but I did want to put an emphasis on one recommendation, Charles, which I forgot to, which was on high-rise, and it's to do with it's recommendation 12. So it's around the suitability of high-rise accommodation for young families, and looking at the fact that, that there were mixed views on the panel. Some panel members are really not fans of high-rise living. For some people, it's a genuine choice, and it works in terms of density and delivering affordability as well. But similar densities can be found in different ways. But the key about this would be a policy kind of change, in a sense, is that if you've got families with young children on the waiting list and they're offered a property above the 5th floor, they should be given the choice of refusing that offer and it not being treated as their single offer. So it's not about saying, because there are local authorities that in the past have not offered families homes above the 5th floor, but we should give choice, because there could be families who would rather not wait longer and take a property above the 5th floor. If they are offered that, they should have the right to turn it down, but be given a further offer in the future, and that gives an element of choice to families as well, because for some people they do not mind at all living above the 5th floor. For some families it's just not suitable.
So my follow-up point is yes, I'm completely happy that we're going to be a campaigning council if that comes ahead, and yeah, happily join you on that, because I completely agree with your recommendations, and I think that to have it owned by the council, I think it's the main premise of this, and then everything else can flow from it. All these recommendations, because we would have it within our gift and our, yeah. So I think that's yeah, I've got nothing else to add. I think that's a really good report. Thank you.
Just agree that to that recommendation 20, we add long-term.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I'm really pleased you liked our report, because we did try and do a comprehensive look at many of the issues related to social housing, but I think one of the recommendations that got lost in the summary is recommendation number 1. And number 1 is about how people are perceived. And we all really, I think, had a long discussion about this, because over many years, living in council housing has been stigmatised, demonised, people about all this nonsense about everybody's scrounger. What? Did you cover it? I beg your pardon, sorry. Maybe I was falling asleep thinking about going home. But I did want to say, I think that the new council, in the new administration, if this is accepted as a sort of blueprint, because there's nothing that's hugely contentious, it's just positive ideas, that one of the things we should do is to have a really positive campaign which shows all the different people from all walks of life, that's what we thought about, who are our council tenants, that they're just people. It's this demarcation about housing is so divisive, and we should be proud of the people who live in our council properties, and we should promote that, that this is a very positive, that this is something that we're very positive about. We own thousands of properties, and we should say good things about people, not about what they do, their jobs or whatever. So I think that would be, personally, I think that would be a really good part of promoting Haringey, rather than talking about stigma, which is what we've experienced for years and years and years. And that's the main point I wanted to say. That's it, really.
Respond to that. I think you've put it in a slightly different way, but that's what I meant about the fact that we should use our communications capacity to promote the image of social housing and actually see it as a positive thing. And actually, that when we look at our housing estates, they are genuinely mixed, actually. And, we should actually, and this is the word that I think I've kind of omitted here, is that social housing shouldn't just be seen as a safety net, it should be seen as a springboard, actually, because it's a security of tenure that actually makes young people who grow up in social housing, who, maybe from poorer backgrounds, that has been the nature of social, and it's about actually the fact that insecure accommodation is one of the biggest problems that we face in terms of education and in terms of health. So children who grow up in accommodation and they're moving all of the time, or they're in situations where their family's got financial hardship and their parents or the main carer can't keep up with the rent, etc. In private sector accommodation, that's actually really, really difficult. Whereas the security of tenure is the key to the difference between a council tenancy and a private sector tenancy. We did raise some issues with some of the people that we spoke to from our social landlords, or our registered social landlords, because we spoke to many people from housing associations as well, and about how over the years people feel that ethos has changed. And everybody knows that the thing that I always bang on about is ground date and the use of ground date, because it's key. Actually, it really is key, and it makes the difference between whether a child is in secure accommodation or not. Because we know in the current culture of casualised labour, of 0 hours contracts, etc., etc. People's incomes change from month to month, and it's extremely easy to fall into 2 months of rent arrears, and that's what ground 8 is basically. That's grounds for eviction. And we know that with a council tenancy, it's a discretionary grounds. With any other form of tenancy, it's a mandatory ground, which means the judge has no option if the family are taken to court. So I think that's what we need to always keep in our mind, that what is it that councils can provide which makes children growing up in council homes more likely to be successful. And the key is security, actually, and lack of stigma. And I think that's changed. You know, me and Zena said when we were growing up, we grew up in social housing. It wasn't seen as a negative. It was just one form of housing.
One thing, then I'll leave you to carry on. I can go home, which is Rowntree gave us very compelling evidence. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I don't think they're any slackers, they gave us compelling evidence, and there's a quote in the evidence somewhere which says that the biggest contributor to dealing with poverty is social housing. It is the biggest, that's not quite the word determinant, but it is the biggest the best way of dealing with poverty is council housing. And I think we don't take account of that at our peril. We know it. Any of us who grew up in council housing know it's true. And we need to think how we are going to do that in order to deal with poverty and to give people stable lives. And those are very important things, and the Rowntree's research is very compelling on that point. So that's...
So we need to agree the recommendations, subject to the bit of wording you were going to clarify on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
And agree this goes forward to a cabinet in the future. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Good. Item 15, scrutiny review on care homes.
Right, okay.
Councillor Connor. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for this. This is an interim report. We've had some issues around sort of getting... We've lost a scrutiny officer, so we were sort of slightly bereft. Apologies, but you've only got the interim at the moment because we wanted to sort of do it justice. So we're going to do it over the summer and have it ready for the next administration, the first OSC or the first Adults and Health panel, whichever comes first, the next administration. But basically, what we wanted to do was have a look, was really to sort of dig down into the care homes, the quality of provision and the workforce that is currently both within the care home sector and the nursing home sector. So basically my panel and I went out, we went into various different types of care homes, different types of providers, and we spoke at length to members of staff. Actually, we got an enormous amount of members of staff at these events. We also spoke to relatives, the clients there, and the actual providers of the home. And what we were careful to do is when we had staff, we didn't have anyone else present, we didn't have any managers present, etc. So we actually had quite an honest debate with them about what their concerns were and what they felt were issues. So really we wanted to do this because obviously we are a big commissioning borough. We commission a lot of the care, and we wanted to make sure that the care we were asking the best we possibly could in all areas. When we started this, we had quite sort of high overarching aims, but actually as we went on there actually became very clear recommendations. I've just given you an extra bit because unfortunately all the recommendations haven't been quite captured on the table on page 3, so I've just given you the second page just basically has the recommendations for the local authority. But what we really got to understand was that, I'll start with the workforce, was that a lot of the people who were doing the care they didn't feel valued because they didn't belong to a body. So there was no recognised body. So if you're a nurse, you belong to a nursing body, you have a nursing qualification, you have your pay, your terms, your conditions, you have your reviews, you know where you are, you have your grading system. And also you have that respect and that recognition that about what you're doing. Within the care setting, we found that carers often felt undervalued in that respect. So we did one which was very... It looks high, it looks like a very high recommendation to recommend that a national body is set up. However, the work we're doing through JOSC, which is the Joint Health Overview and Scrutiny, is also looking at this concurrently at the moment. So Dawn Wakefield, who is one of the strategic members looking at this, is actually looking to feed this into the Green Paper, which is going through Parliament. So although this is a small cog, we actually wanted to feed into the five boroughs through JOSC and then hopefully further up as it goes through. So there was scope for looking at how we would achieve this, whether we could look at asking providers to agree to an initial couple of weeks training that every person who gave care would undertake, and then whether they would then get a recognised sort of certificate for that, and then how actually this could go on to be developed. So if you were specialising looking after someone with learning disabilities, or if you're looking after somebody with mental health issues, could you then specialise? Like you do in any other profession, you have specialities, and whether that could then be recognised. Because we obviously thought that pay really should sort of follow particular specialities. If you're doing sort of very high-end specialised care, then actually that should be recognised in your pay terms and conditions. But that will only happen if you have a body that, you know, and you have your own sort of support mechanisms within that. So anyway, that was one of the sort of more high-ended sort of recommendations for workforce. The other ones were around just appraisals for pay review, sort of clear career pathways. I've said about the differences, and forums for care workers to meet up and discuss, because actually most people working within any industry in any area know how things can improve, but they don't often get that fed up through the management system. So actually a forum where people who are providing care can get together, have those conversations, come up with their own ideas and come up with their own sort of things we thought would be incredibly useful. And then we actually said at the end about local colleges maybe being set up to provide accredited training appropriate to a new care working body. So that was just something on the workforce. Carers and clients. What we found was that that the first conversation that people often had with a social worker for review or to actually go into a care home was incredibly stressful. It usually happened at a point where something had happened in order to make that person have to go in. So they'd become very ill, or there was a stroke, or there was suddenly something that needed to happen. And most people didn't really have an understanding of what their rights were, what they should be asking, what questions they should have, So we were saying, well, we should have an independent advocate for that first review so that they really get supported in that first process. There's an annual review with the social worker to see whether that placement is still appropriate, because that I'm not sure that happened. So what we got was that the social worker came along and said, oh, right, so this is the review. But there wasn't really a feeling, because needs often change quite dramatically. But we especially found from the providers that they then said that wasn't really taken into account. So extra support wasn't necessarily then provided. So a review was done, but nothing actually changed, even though clients' needs had changed. So that needs to be looked at. A look for one change to improve carer experience. I mean, this came from a personal conversation with one of the clients in the care home, and I won't go into details, but there was an issue where that person had been asking for somebody that they had cared for a very long time, who also had their own needs, to come in. They could go and visit them, or that person could come and visit, and that hadn't happened in over a year. So it's just really looking at something that makes a real big, huge difference. it would be a small thing to get that person organised to go in to visit, but actually that was a huge thing for that person because they'd been a carer for that person for over 20 years, and suddenly that loss of contact was huge. So something like that, just looking for one change. So better information around community provision, spot checks undertaken by Healthwatch and every provider that we have a contract with, and they speak to clients and carers, and then that report is actually sent to us as a local authority and the CCG, so there's some ownership of that report. Providers, they had real concerns about the money that was coming into them, and there was a lot of concern about whether they could remain viable in the current climate. So it's really how they address those concerns, how they have that conversation with us and the CCG, and that we are given heads up early on so they don't just suddenly close and we're suddenly left trying to find places for people within our borough. So it's how we can forward plan, how we can support them in that. And with providers as well, making sure about safeguarding. We've got this new gold standard that's come in through the scrutiny process about making safeguarding personal, how that is actually given out to carers and the clients they have, and basically just details around that. Local authority, we have a really useful sort of strategic oversight. We have a foot in all sorts of doors, which we can then ask different people to come in, ask for oversight to be done. We've got the access across, as I said, through JOSC on the 5 boroughs. We've got the ability to discuss if there are concerns with the Health Minister through scrutiny. We've got the ability to work with the CCG and the providers in the forum. So let's use that, really. Let's be a little bit more clever about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and making sure that what we come up with is useful. Looking at ways to pull in other providers, so access to community matrons. We've got the new neighbourhood teams coming up. We've got physios, OT, transport issues. A lot of those problems that we came across could, not easily, but could be sorted out. But we just needed to focus. We needed to join up different areas to get different groups speaking to each other. Actually, then we could sort something out. So with physios, it's just how you get access to those physios, those OTs. And actually, once you've done that, we could actually facilitate a much smoother pathway. We've done this community asset mapping, how that actually works within the home care setting. So if people are getting care at home, we've got all this lovely asset mapping now about all these lovely things that are close to people's homes, in the voluntary sector, in the community, but actually are people in the home actually being able to access any of this? Or are they just staying at home behind closed doors and actually not going out and getting access to this? So it's really looking at the care providers and have they actively tried to get that person out, get that person into sort of different groups, have they tried to work that out? So it's not just a tick box exercise, but we need sort of a real understanding of what they've actually done, what trails they've followed, what pathways they've followed to try and make sure that happens. So review discharge from hospital assessment within 3 months to ensure that was working properly. I've said about the 5 boroughs with pay, and also about hubs and making sure that GPs and the GP settings, the nurses and the physios and OTs actually are involved. So if people are getting care in their own home or getting care in a different provider setting, do they still have access to their GP? And often they don't. So how we make sure that that happens, talking to the CCG who have that connection with the GPs and making sure that, again, those systems do join up. I know they're looking at it at the moment. They're doing a lot of work in it, but just making sure that we feed into that conversation at the right time so that we don't miss that opportunity. So that's a very brief outline of what we've got. Obviously, it'll be fleshed out with a lot more statistics and report. But anyway, that's to come. So any questions?
Okay. Okay. My first question under the workforce section is that there's no mention of the role of trade unions in terms of negotiating terms and conditions. There's also. I mean, it's good to see kind of recognition of the problems for care workers working in different sectors, but one of the reasons for that is that kind of, you know, under kind of austerity policies pursued by not just the current government, but kind of a lot of the last few, is that services have been outsourced to cut costs. The first way that they cut costs is to drive down terms and conditions and kind of also casualise the workforce and kind of in some care homes there's no trade union recognition or kind of membership, and kind of activity is much more discouraged.
Thank you. That's a really good point. I did think about this. I think it's the whole idea of setting up a body. So, and I think I use nursing because, to be honest, that's what I know. So within that, and as I always say, I'm a member of the Royal College of Nursing, which is our trade union, as of our sort of body of people to. So, but that's because we've got a body already. So as a nurse, you become a registered general nurse, so you've got that, you've got your pay and conditions, and then alongside that would then come any other sort of form of representation. I mean, as a scrutiny committee, we couldn't sort of recommend that they have to do certain things, but I think that would naturally develop as it has within the nursing sector, because to be honest, if you don't have the right terms, paying conditions, what we're finding is that people aren't staying. So they're not staying, and what we're looking to do is provide a stable workforce, not just within Haringey, but within our 5 boroughs that we work very closely with. But if we don't have good working conditions, if we don't think about how we're going to support them, if we don't make them feel valued and give them that recognition, then they're going to go, or they're going to go off and do something else. So yes, that's a problem, but yeah, it's how we begin to look at it. I think what we've done is given sort of big sort of ideas, and then obviously the proof will be in the pudding, but thank you, that's a good point.
Other points? Well, let's Councillor Guy.
Just very quickly, also I think it's a very good report, Pippa, and so I just wasn't quite clear about the process. Are you saying that there needs to be further evidence-gathering sessions, or is it just that the report needs to be sort of written up?
Well, there's 2 points to that. Yes, the report needs to be written up with a lot more detail and information within it, but I think because it was a springboard, and what we found through working in the JOSC is that they're going to come back to us in October with how they're taking forward the workforce. To be honest, I've already given them our set of recommendations, and they're taking that forward as part of their process. And then we're going to get, whoever's sitting on JOSC will get feedback from that about the workforce and about how this has been taken forward. And then another piece of work there may come from it. So that kind of answers it, but yeah.
Okay, so what are you asking the committee to do with these at this stage?
So to agree the recommendations that you have been given, and then to note that obviously this report is going to be fleshed out with more information behind it as to how we came to those recommendations, but an understanding that actually I think this is a springboard report that actually could then be utilised. You know, more work could be done on this depending on how the conversations and the work comes through from the JOSC.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I mean, as you know, there is work going on across the North London boroughs on this, and it's a important point that whoever comes forward onto the Joint Health Scrutiny Committee is sort of, looking at this sort of stuff in particular, because they have a work programme, both looking at the workforce and looking at providers and the so-called market, which they have to look at because it's in the Health and Social Care Act, but it is actually a relatively positive process there, which the JOSC is looking at, but also scrutiny within Haringey needs to look at as well.
Yep.
So on that basis, can we agree those recommendations? Good. Thank you. Work programme. I mean, we're asked to identify any areas of scrutiny work that we think should be rolled forward into the new municipal year. I mean, it'll obviously be for the new committee to take a view as to how it wants to plan its work programme, and indeed, the panels are in the gift of the scrutiny committee. So the committee may decide to do something different with panels, although it may not, but it can, because the remits of the panels are not part of the constitution. So I mean, the only point we did start some work around fire safety and high buildings and so on, and that was quite useful work, but it was quite difficult to sort of get it programmed and through. And obviously the Grenfell inquiry is underway, and there's been various recommendations which kept coming through around building regs and that sort of thing. But we did have some good sessions with Homes for Haringey and with building control and planning. So it's the basis of work which is relevant locally. And I think it would be useful to recommend that the next committee looks to how it can conclude that work and pick up on the data which has come through in those sessions, which was useful actually, particularly in respect of building control and how they operate, because that's absolutely key, I think, to this. So, I mean, I'd recommend that bit of work, which isn't concluded and could go forward. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts about work going forward, or do we leave that to the next group of members to take care of? Any points?
I mean, I'm not sure if this is a formal recommendation, but on environment, we said that the next panel should be looking at the effect of green waste charges and the various charges that were introduced over the last 12 months and the cumulative impact of those. And I think we kind of put a note in that they should return to that in the new municipal year.
Yeah. Any other key points to go forward from panel chairs?
I think just in adults and health, I think we've given them quite a full list of for a year. So I won't sort of go through it now, but I think we've structured it so that the next people coming in, it'll be at least they'll have something there, and it'll be quite, you know, as a follow-on, because there's a lot of things that we're trying to keep updated and on top of. So I think that's what we're going to do. But just to note that we've got a full year's work planned already, so it'll be up to them to take it or not. But yeah, it's there.
I mean, that's useful, actually. I mean, I think planning over more than 12 months actually is sort of lesson that one could sort of offer as far as scrutiny goes. Any other points on the work programme? No. Any new items of urgent business? No. Right. Future meetings. I'll be circulating members around any future meetings we may need. Before the changeover. It's my last meeting. Can I thank officers? Not everyone's here. Who's helped and put enormous amounts of work in with the the committee and the panels. But I will pass my thanks on to officers and to members. Not all members are here. Kirsten's not here, but thanks members as well for an exciting 12 months. And good luck those of you who will be here in the future. Thanks.